Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Extended Day Ahead Market Workshop. We'll be discussing transmission in Bucket 2 during today's session. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'm also joined by Partha Malvadkar, our Principal of RA Infrastructure and Grid Enhancements on our Market Policy and Performance team, and he will be our lead presenter today. The materials that we will be discussing today, mainly the presentation, is available out on the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative webpage on the California ISO website. And you can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, and then under the Stay Informed tab, you'll navigate to Policy Initiatives, and then the Edam webpage will be listed on that landing page. Before we get started, I wanted to cover just a couple housekeeping reminders. So first, this call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These calls, workshops, meetings are structured to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives with the understanding that stakeholders have reviewed the material. And then as a reminder, in the interest of time today, please just refrain from repeating or reiterating what has already been said so we can address as many questions and comments as possible. And then if at any point today you need technical assistance, you can send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Yossi. But finally, just thank you for joining us, and we look forward to an engaging discussion today. We will be accepting questions throughout the call today. And if you connected to audio through your computer or use the Call Me option through WebEx, then you'll just need to select that raise hand icon, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen above the chat window. But if you called in separately and did not use that Call Me feature, you'll need to press #2 to enter the queue. And we can give these instructions again later on today when we are ready for questions. But when you do ask a question, please just remember to state your name and affiliation before speaking. And then you can also send your question via chat to either myself, again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists. So with that, I will hand it over to Partha, and we'll kick it off. Oh, Partha, I think you're on mute.
Is that better?
Yes, sounds good.
Yeah. Thanks, Isabella. And I first want to say thanks to all the stakeholders for taking the time today for this workshop on Bucket 2 transmission. I also really want to thank stakeholders again for their comments on the straw proposal. We received a lot of constructive feedback related to Bucket 2 transmission, and I hope today's discussion can help both us at the ISO and you all in the stakeholder community to understand the reasons better behind the positions taken to date, and to allow for a constructive dialogue on solutions and on next steps as we continue to explore how to best incorporate transmission in the EDM. Just to level set again, as we're trying to bridge the OAT transmission world and processes in with the ISO market structure under an extended day ahead market, there's been a lot of learning that happened so far, and I really appreciate that all the stakeholders have reached out and for the discussions that we've had. We're really hoping for an active and constructive participation from everyone on this call. As for today's agenda, we plan on starting off with a brief discussion on the voluntary transmission option under Bucket 2. This was the option that was discussed primarily in the workshop process and laid out in the straw proposal. We're also going to have a discussion on another alternative that was discussed in the straw proposal, namely unused Bucket 2 transmission automatically being included into the EDAM market. And finally, we're going to have a brief discussion that will be led by Deb Levine, as well as James Lynn, in terms of some implementation considerations and the process on implementation going forward. Yep, thank you, Isabella. So before we sort of jump into Bucket 2 transmission, I want to provide a brief refresher on transmission availability in the EDAM. which is really critical to ensuring a feasible day-ahead market commitment and optimizing efficient transfers from resources across the EDAM footprint. While EDAM entities retain their transmission planning functions and continue to offer transmission service under their OATs, the ISO straw proposal outlined different transmission buckets where each EDAM entity will identify the transmission that may be available to the EDAM market to support transfers between EDAM entities and across the EDAM footprint. So looking at sort of the three different buckets that were described, well, we're going to be focusing on bucket 2 transmission today. I wanted to sort of provide a brief refresher on bucket 1 and bucket 3 transmission, mainly because I recognize the fact there are likely to be overlapping issues between those three buckets, and providing that context might help facilitate a better dialogue when we're getting into some of the specifics on bucket 2. So just as a reminder on bucket 1 transmission, as we're defining it, is really firm and or conditional firm transmission required to support the resource sufficiency obligation resources offered by specific LSEs. The bucket 3, on the other hand, is the unsold firm transmission made available to support transfers at the interties between the BAs. So as a reminder on bucket 3 in particular, that the ISO straw proposal primarily focused on two different approaches for it. Approach 1 was where the EDAM entities would make bucket 3 transmission available to the market for optimization at a hurdle rate. And approach 2 is really exploring a variety of alternatives to make bucket 3 transmission available to the market hurdle-free with various options for cost recovery. As a part of the next transmission working group meeting, we're going to really hone in on some of the bucket 3 issues to see if we can move the needle on developing out a hurdle-free proposal that still allows for appropriate transmission cost recovery. But we're here today to focus on bucket 2, and I think that certainly based on the comments, I think there's some overlapping issues that we'll likely hear, particularly as it relates to hurdle rates and equity issues between bucket 2 and bucket 3 transmission. So this is sort of the opening slide, which really provides sort of a high-level description on participants' views. And I'm not going to read it for you. I'm going to skip over the details. But for lack of a better term, I think that the key message here is really that stakeholders were pretty divided on whether bucket 2 should be only voluntarily made to the EDAM market by transmission customers, or whether unscheduled firm transmission should be automatically available to the EDAM for optimization. Each set of parties in their comments provide sort of the risks, benefits, pros and cons between these two options. So as a part of this discussion, we're going to provide kind of an overview of the positions taken by parties in the slides. I certainly would appreciate and welcome parties who wanted to sort of elaborate, provide additional details in terms of why they have that position. We've also taken the feedback and try to work through some proactive solutions and try to see if we can bridge some of the positions taken by various parties. And so that'll be at least part of the dialogue as well as we move forward. I thought I might stop there. Isabella, this might be a good time to at least sort of open it up for participants, just in terms of sort of the level setting for this workshop, to see if there's sort of opening comments about the agenda or about the topics that we might want to discuss at this point in time.
Sure. Yeah, so as a reminder, if you would like to raise your hand, you can do so by pressing the raise hand icon above the chat window, or if you connect to audio separately, you can press #2 and that will enter you in the queue. So Yossi, will you let us know if anyone raises their hand or enters the queue?
Sure.
Okay, I'm not seeing any.
We do not have any questions over the phone as well.
Yep, that sounds perfect. Well, we'll jump into some of these, into sort of these two different options on bucket 2 transmission. If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide as well. So this slide we really kind of level set in terms of the voluntary bucket 2 framework and what sort of the concept around this. And kind of at a fundamental level, the bucket 2 voluntary framework consists of transmission rights that are held by transmission customers of the EDAM entity or another transmission service provider within the EDAM BA, being able to voluntarily make these available to the EDAM market in return for transfer revenue. To ensure reliable transfers, the proposal was to require that bucket 2 transmission be firm or conditionally firm in order to be offered into the EDAM marketplace. And that we also, as a part of the original proposal, had that the transmission rights holders must coordinate with the EDAM entity before the day-ahead market run at 10 a.m. to offer as transmission rights in the EDAM, and that these would be offered in hurdle-free. Sort of the final piece in terms of framing out the concept was that we viewed that once the transmission customer voluntarily makes these transmission rights available to the EDAM for optimization, they would not be recallable, and that if there's in real time, sort of post the EDAM market run. So moving on to the slide 9. This slide, again, we're going to get into some of the specifics, but at least I thought I'd sort of frame out kind of the high level comments that we received in terms of the voluntary approach, both in support of as well as concerns raised by specific stakeholders around this option. Stakeholders in support particularly noted that the discretion left each transmission customers, and that they highlighted that this really allowed for operational ability and flexibility in terms of how their rights are exercised in a manner that's sort of not degrading their rights. Stakeholders also noted, and we'll get into more discussion in the following slides with some examples later on how such a model would avoid the risk of uplift costs or redispatch being borne by these transmission customers if these rights were offered into the EDAM and subsequently they need to use them in real time. Participants also noted, this is the third item, in terms of the voluntary approach being sort of best retaining the value of the long-term firm rights and investments. Other commenters highlighted really that such a voluntary approach really is sort of the best way in terms of incenting new investment and working with the framework in terms of transmission build-outs and the investments of rights. Finally, I'd note that a few participants recommended that transmission should be made available at a hurdle rate as a part of bucket 2, where that should be allowed as an option to properly value the rights rather than only be able to receive congestion revenues. We have a subsequent slide dedicated to this hurdle rate option for bucket 2. However, I'd note that since we're really looking for ways to minimize or eliminate hurdle rates for bucket 3, it will likely wouldn't make sense to introduce a hurdle rate via bucket 2, and that, but a lot of the participants in particular argued based on a comparability element that maybe bucket 2 should also have a hurdle rate. So we're going to have a brief discussion on that in terms of some of the comments received. At least in terms of opposition, and there's sort of a flip side of these arguments that we're going to include in sort of the following discussion as well. A lot of the participants noted sort of transmission market power concerns that could be exacerbated by the ability to hold out transmission from the EDAM market. And then there was sort of significant discussion as well on impacts on congestion and phantom congestion that might occur if transmission rights were systematically not included in the EDAM market, but were included in the subsequent EIM market runs. The last two in particular are relevant, and that I think that we've had a lot of discussions in Trinity CAISO on our historical experience, where in particular at the startup of the market, we had directly excluded some of the existing transmission contracts from the market, but saw significant inefficiencies, which led us to change course internally. This experience really led us to wanting to pursue more whether we can do better from a market efficiency standpoint without degrading the current transmission rights or affecting reliability. And we received a number of comments from market participants, which also noted that the historical practice of excluding ETCs created a systematic modeling error between the day-ahead market and real-time market runs, and that the experience from these participants really as well led them to conclude that they recognize that there are associated costs and risks associated with redispatch between day-ahead and real-time, but that from these participants' judgment, those associated costs outweighed, were outweighed by the benefits from an overall efficiency standpoint in terms of the market run. If you wouldn't mind switching back, Isabella. So the ISOs, particularly, we're going to see comments and discussions. We saw comments and discussions in the working groups on whether the scope of bucket 2 transmission should be expanded to include unscheduled transmission. And under such a proposed, the EDM entities would make the firm or conditional firm rights not exercised to customers available by 10 a.m. To the market run. And that we received a lot of feedback in this of maybe we could do better and that there were sort of additional avenues that we should explore in order to move this to a more robust and more efficient outcome. And so I think that that's what we're going to be discussing in detail in that next section is sort of what and how we can move forward with a level playing field for all participants, making those rights available. Thanks, Isabella. If you wouldn't mind flipping to the next slide. So this slide really focuses on the hurdle rate option that stakeholders' positions were positioned to say, and that some stakeholders really suggested that the firm transmission rights held by customers should be made available at a hurdle rate, and that this would really provide a greater incentive to make these rights available, as well as reflect the value of transmission. Kind of on the flip side, we heard sort of a variety of concerns with including a hurdle rate, and that sort of similar to the arguments on whether or not to make the voluntary versus mandatory, there was, a variety of concerns on the potential market efficiencies with including a hurdle rate. And this is really the same discussion we had on bucket 3 of whether or not this was really creating sort of an increased burden to transactions by having that extra charge available, including that in the market run. Stakeholders as well included a lot of discussion as well in terms of some of those concerns, and particularly on the hurdle rate on withholding transmission. And I think this sort of impacts on pricing and market power. And I think kind of the key message on the hurdle rate that from the discussion was that the entities that would primarily have an incentive to have a hurdle rate, the converse indicated would be those who owned or controlled a significant portion of that transmission and might have an incentive to try to use the hurdle rate in order to exercise market power or to withhold that transmission from the market. So thank you, Isabella. I'll pause there before we go on to the automatic inclusion of unscheduled transmission, and I want to open up again for participants. If there's anyone who wants to sort of clarify their positions they've taken or add to it, I certainly would welcome the questions and or feedback just in terms of how we've scoped up the comments and positions so far.
As a reminder to raise your hand, you can do so by pressing the raise hand icon above the chat window, or you can press #2. Do you have any callers in the queue?
We do not.
Oh, it looks like one just popped in. You, Laura?
Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Laura Trelise from the Energy Authority, and I just had a question about, I haven't read through all the comments, but on the hurdle rate for bucket 2, I think one of the differences between bucket 2 and bucket 3 in regards to a hurdle rate is for bucket 3 transmission, the transmission service provider wouldn't receive any congestion revenues. And so if there were to be some kind of hurdle rate for bucket 2, and I know that's not what you're suggesting, but would bucket 2 receive both some hurdle rate, but then also be eligible for congestion revenues as well?
That's a good question, and at least in terms of that bucket 2 transmission, I think that's what participants were implying, was that bucket 2 transmission would be eligible for both an allocation of the transfer revenues and congestion revenues, as well as a hurdle rate in their comments. At least in terms of the positions that we heard, yes, that's what I believe that participants were implying. But if others want to weigh in, or those participants who comment on it and correct me, I'd be interested in hearing their feedback.
Great, thank you.
We have a caller over the phone. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, please make sure your device is not set on mute.
Do we have any other questions?
We do not.
Okay. I think we can move into.
I apologize as well. I might have to go off video as my computer is freezing, so I apologize for that delay. So yeah, thanks for the questions. Well, in that case, I think we can move on to the bucket 2 and the automatic inclusion of unscheduled transmission options. So in this section, we really highlight sort of what the concept is around including unscheduled transmission as a part of the EDM design, and that the key element, at least to highlight, would be that the transmission customer's firm transmission rights, which are not scheduled at 10 a.m., will be automatically included into the EDM market, and that the goal of this is to maximize the transmission available to optimize transfer and derive benefits. As a part of the proposal, at least in terms of the alternative, we teed up the idea that this would be a uniform requirement for all EDM entities in terms of making these firm transmission rights available. But we'll get into a little bit later. But we heard we heard some feedback just in terms of some exceptions and some differences from this general approach that we might want to consider as well. Just in terms of that concept as well, I think that what's really sort of key and fundamental, and I think this is also something that people really honed in on their comments, was that the firm transmission rights can continue to be exercised between the day-ahead and real-time market, consistent with the existing arrangements they have. There's a recognition by participants and by the ISO, and we'll provide some examples around this, of how having these exercises having these rights both included into the Edam market, but also having optionality to exercise those rights between the day and real-time market may drive potential uplift costs that will need to be addressed, and that there's various options we're going to tee up for how those uplift costs can be sort of properly addressed while not degrading the transmission customers' existing rights and arrangements. And finally, at least I'd note that under the concept, the transmission rights that are being made available can accrue congestion rents, and that these congestion rents for these unscheduled transmission can be settled with the Edam entity. We anticipate as well, and we're gonna weigh into this discussion a little bit, sort of at our own peril, but that each of these Edam entities will likely need to have its own stakeholder process and tariff process in order to define how those rents are allocated ultimately to transmission customers. So jumping to slide 13, this is really just a level setting slide on what the current FERC OAT says about the timing and release of transmission capacity. The key takeaway for me really is that firm point-to-point rights, is required to be submitted by the transmission provider by 10 a.m., but will be accommodated after that timeline if practical. And we'd be interested in understanding more about how this tariff provisions are enacted today. I think that that's sort of really key for market participants to understand in terms of market participants and the ISO in terms of where are these existing arrangements, how are these enacted in practice today. And I think that there's some intent, I think we should as well, we'd really be interested in having some of the Edam entities share their thinking about those redispatch and cost assignments, and that we have some discussion as well. There's some discussion in the comments where certain participants highlighted the fact that this 10 a.m. deadline, that they recognize existing OAT and they weren't wanting to degrade the rights of entities, but that maybe there should be some consideration in each of the Edam entities in terms of if there are rights submitted after this 10 a.m. deadline, whether or not there should be a different treatment in the Edam entities' own allocation processes, and how could there be better incentives to submit those transmission arrangements on a timely manner and or make transmission available to the market. So moving on to slide 14. So slide 14 really just highlights a few of the high-level messages on stakeholder positions that we heard in the comments. And that, as I indicated, there really was kind of a split, but a significant number of the stakeholders supported the concept of unscheduled transmission being made available to the Edam, if not scheduled by that 10 a.m. deadline. In support of this automatic inclusion, they highlighted, as indicated before, sort of the benefits in terms of maximizing the benefits to the markets and avoiding the phantom congestion that could be created if the existing transmission contracts and pre-sold rights were withheld by the transmission market. Participants also highlighted that such approach would be consistent with FERC policy, and that that the real key is sort of allowing these rights to be exercised between day ahead and real time, and not degrading the current rights and arrangements in terms of both the hedge value as well as the ultimate use of these rights by participants from a physical basis. Finally, at least in terms of this slide, I think that there was significant recognition that there needs to be flexibility to recognize unique situations and exceptions, and that I think that our next slide will get into some of those exceptions in terms of what those potential risks are, and this might be ways to sort of bridge some of the concerns raised earlier by participants who supported just a voluntary model, and that maybe some of these exceptions, if enacted, we feel like they could help materially address the issues raised by market participants. So flipping to slide 15. So slide 15 really focuses on the exceptions. In particular, I think that the first thing that was the level set was that we anticipated the transmission rights secured under OAT would be the ones we're really focusing on subjecting to this unscheduled transmission requirement, and that our goal is that, and at least sort of described in the straw proposal, we have a common set of rules among EDAM entities that had a level playing field, and that it wouldn't be sort of done on an EDAM by EDAM entity basis, but we're looking for comments particularly on that if there are sort of specific practices or rights held within that EDAM market construct that might require different structures within different EDAM entities. The second exception I think that participants highlighted, and I think we agree with, is that there might need to be different practices from the pre-OAT and legacy transmission arrangements that would not be such that some of these rights would not be automatically made available for the markets, and that this would not be part of the requirement if we went this route to automatically make such transmission rights to the market. And that participants in highlighting these, they really highlighted that they're not governed by the terms of the OATs, and that they might have special provisions regarding the exercise of use that's not consistent with making these automatically available to the EDAM market, as well as allowing that participants really were looking for potential discretion under certain circumstances in terms of how these are made available. In terms of one of the comments I was going to highlight in particular, one of the parties, and at least I'll say that really highlighted that there might be sort of ways that we need to really look at whether or not sort of the cost benefits of including specific transmission rights, and that if we're basically we might need some sort of process that either the EDAM entity is enacting or that the CAISO is enacting, such that if we're seeing excessive uplift costs, and or potential gaming of the market, that the CAISO or the EDAM entity should have the authority to suspend the basically requirement that we turn over all unscheduled rights to the EDAM market by 10 a.m. and that there should be some process to monitor the impacts to market uplift as well as to efficiency and adjust accordingly. And maybe I'd highlight as well, I think that a number of market participants on the flip side said, if we went down the rights of only requiring at market startup that the voluntarily made available transmission rights be included in the optimization. I think participants as well highlighted going that route, that sort of similar process might be necessary to say, is there sort of significant phantom congestion, and that should there be a potential sort of one-offs to that other model of the voluntary model to say, well, there are certain rights that might need to be automatically included because there are sort of large differences and discrepancies. So if we want to jump to slide 16. So in slide 16, I really just want to highlight and provide a brief background on some of the stakeholder concerns here as well. First, if the transmission holders exercise their rights out of market between day ahead and real time, stakeholders really honed in the fact that this will result in market re-optimization and could likely increase congestion costs between day ahead and real time. And that really seemed like it was the primary concern that stakeholders were focused in on, was that degradation of the value of the rights as well as potential uplift costs that would be borne between real time. So in the following slides, we have a couple of examples, and that just for the sake of this audience, I wanted to make sure that at a conceptual level that participants understood how these uplift costs might occur, and that at least it would sort of allow for a dialogue just in terms of what are the solutions to help address this and what are the trade-offs as we move forward. At least in terms of some of the other comments, again, there was a variety of comments raised just in terms of an automatic inclusion framework, potentially degrading the value of the rights and degrading the incentives to invest in transmission and transmission expansion. And finally, I'd note that some stakeholders raised concerns, and this is particularly our the CAISO Department of Market Monitoring raised concerns that we'll need to further explore, just in terms of how allowing unscheduled firm rights to be included in bucket 2 may have reliability considerations that need to be addressed, particularly if the RUC assumes that supporting transmission lines are available in its processes. So in the next two slides, I have a couple of examples that are really, again, high level, but maybe for the sake of discussion, I'd be interested in hearing more for participants just in terms of, did my description in terms of the comments and positions as well as the solutions sort of spur on any additional thoughts by you all in terms of what other solutions should we explore? Would some of these solutions, particularly around exceptions, help address some of the concerns that are raised, or is there sort of additional clarifications that folks want to make just in terms of the concerns that they had? So, Isabella, maybe we can open up the phone line.
Sure. Yep, so if you have a question, again, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand icon above the chat window. But if you connected to audio separately outside the WebEx, you'll need to press #2. So we'll give it a minute. I see one in the queue, so maybe we could go to Steve.
Hi, this is Steve Lincoln with TransAlta, and I didn't want to get too far away from slide 13 because you had mentioned a desire to get some feedback about the usage of transmission between the day-ahead and real-time market. And our experience is with Bonneville Transmission and its firm capacity. And we have the ability to schedule or to submit firm schedules well after 10 a.m. of the pre-scheduled day. And do so regularly. And it seemed like it was if we're thinking of that transmission capacity, it seems like a fatal flaw to assume that there isn't much of that activity that's going, and it seems to invite problems like you've mentioned with the uplift from redispatch costs. And I was encouraged that you are interested in not degrading the transmission customers' rights because there are, I think, a lot of customers who use their firm capacity long after 10 a.m. of the pre-scheduled day.
That's really helpful. Would you mind expanding a little bit just in terms of some of the practices, and I guess the question back I'd have is there, I guess, can you describe some of the reasons why you need to schedule sort of in real time and sort of that basically, for lack of a better term, after that 10 a.m. scheduled deadline described in the pro forma OAT, and as well as I think I'd be interested as well just in terms of, I think we'll have some discussion later just in terms of some of that EDM entity thinking around solutions to hold customers harmless if they need to redispatch, and that, or at least home harmless might be the wrong term, mitigate some of the impacts of redispatch costs. And so, yeah, but like I'd also be interested in sort of hearing more about your experience with Bonneville.
Yeah, I guess I could just offer at a very high level to say that it's just a matter of optimization and utilizing the transmission capacity to its fullest. And if at customers who operate real-time desks will certainly do this, in that if the capacity isn't fully used in day ahead by pre-schedule, then that capacity still has value to participate in the real-time market, bilateral real-time market. And so any unused capacity certainly won't just sit there. Customers will endeavor to use the capacity to its fullest right up until the WEC scheduling deadline 20 minutes before the hour. So it's just a matter of optimization and making the best use of the transmission while customers are participating in the bilateral real-time market.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you for that feedback. Just one more question. Do you have any sense, and I'm not looking for exact number, is this, do you have sort of some sense of like percentages? Is this like a 50% is currently transacted after that 10 a.m. deadline, or is this 10% or 90%? I'm just interested in sort of understanding your experience of sort of what the what those impacts might look like.
Yeah, it's difficult to answer because every customer's experience will differ, but I think it would be safe to say that it's I would assume that most customers would endeavor to say achieve a 70-30% split, whereas they try to have as much business as possible wrapped up in pre-schedule, and perhaps 30%. And I'm just throwing that out there as a likely guess of what others might be doing too, but to have as much as possible wrapped up in pre-schedule, and then a smaller percentage left in real time to optimize. So definitely the minority would be in real time.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Really appreciate the comment as well as that additional background. That's really helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's go to Ian.
Hi, Partha. Ian White from Shell Energy. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm on a little bit of a shaky connection today. Thanks for holding this call. I think that this will be a good forum. One of the things I think we're concerned about is the fact that a lot of entities across the West may be, for lack of a better term, sub-participants of an EIM entity, or in this case, an Edam entity. And to build on Steve's example, for customers that are scheduling within the Bonneville Power Administration or any other BA, if that BA ends up electing to join Edam, the market design for bucket 2 then becomes very relevant to these entities that are sort of sub-scheduling within that Edam balancing authority area. And I think one of the things that's difficult about it from our perspective is we don't necessarily have a great line of sight in terms of mitigating the impacts to our business that entry into the Edam may cause us. And so having the ability to have a stakeholder determined hurdle rate, if applicable, or at the very least having some ability to not have unscheduled rights sort of taken by the market at 10 a.m., I think is really important. A couple examples of activities in which and a stakeholder may be scheduling after this 10 a.m. window. Sometimes in the real-time market, you will have hourly scheduling of renewables, which of course requires some transmission. And then of course you have re-optimizing your resources or load. And also I think one example for entities that participate in CAISO's intertime market is you have CAISO's day-ahead awards being published at noon to 2 p.m. generally, and so that would come after the 10 a.m. window in the day-ahead time frame. And that day-ahead awards, once they're published, to the extent that the SC has not already reserved the transmission capacity, would then need to go ahead and do so. So I think just to highlight, we see this requirement as potentially impacting sort of the voluntary feel of Edam and EIM. And the other thing, I guess, just to finally add, it's not entirely clear to me how this would square with and work with forthcoming elements of the Western Resource Adequacy Program, which do have a day ahead or a forward transmission requirement as well as a transmission requirement on the operating day. So yeah, just some things I'd like I wanted to comment on. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Ian. If you wouldn't mind, I want to follow up on at least on a couple of points you made, and there might be other CAISO panelists as well who have maybe I'll turn and see if there's any other CAISO panelists who have follow-up questions or clarifications first.
This is Milos with the California ISO. Can you hear me okay, Martha?
I can. Perfect.
All right. Yeah, and thanks, Ian, for the question. And maybe just on, and maybe this is where you were going, Partha, with the comment from Ian. But maybe Ian, if under the concept of this unscheduled transmission, I know we didn't get to that necessarily, but it's one of the next few slides. But if unscheduled transmission is made available and the entity continues to retain the right to exercise those previously unscheduled transmission rights, but if we find ways of mitigating or at least working through the redispatch uplifts question, would that, at least in concept, have alleviated some of those fears? Would that put you kind of into a similar position where you are today, that effectively you can exercise those rights between day ahead and real time? And I think one of the next few slides kind of talks through how can we work through this uplift question if those rights are exercised. But wanted to get your thoughts. Is this kind of a no-go for you, or is it a matter of really just addressing those uplifts on the back end that may potentially materialize if those rights are exercised, which those uplifts may not apply all the time, but if there are resulting uplifts, managing that, would that give you a bit more comfort?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that if redispatch costs were minimized or eliminated for entities that are scheduling from day ahead to real time, I think that would definitely reduce my skepticism on this point. And really, that's just a function of my participation by and through an Edam entity in the market. I don't want the market scheduling abilities to be, overtly or covertly hampered by the market design. And so I think, yeah, just thinking through it initially, if there were some ability to minimize or completely eliminate those redispatch costs, I think that really would help with that point. I think the other way to potentially do it is to have entities have the ability to make transmission available on a voluntary basis, either using a hurdle rate like we've already discussed, or potentially if we do move forward again with the unscheduled rights becoming part of the market optimization, having entities have the ability to exempt certain rights on certain days if they need to use them for some reason, or they foresee the need to use them for some reason, could possibly be another way forward. Sorry, that wasn't very clear. If you need me to clarify.
No. Got it. Yeah, no. Fair point. And I think maybe, once we get to these next few slides, or we talk about some of these redispatch implications, maybe we can talk about some of those ways of, mitigating potentially some of those uplifts. Is there a way for the transmission provider working with its transmission customers, and in this context of this particular slide, as I've been thinking about it, I recognize that this is the pro forma language that by 10 a.m. certain actions are taking place. Some transmission providers, they have different time frames, but can you get to a similar place effectively that there's some level of confidence that's provided to the transmission provider, or some estimation of how much of these rights are going to be exercised and how many are not, and maybe that can be a factor in here as well. So good thought. Let's keep that thought in mind as we go through, I think, some of the slides a bit later and talking about some of the consequences and how to mitigate those.
Thanks, Milos.
Well, Ian, I had one other follow-up, and at least I really appreciate the points you made just in terms of some sort of the rationale why participants will submit schedules after the 10 a.m. Deadline. And particularly, I think you highlighted a couple issues. One was kind of the hourly scheduling practices, and particularly for, renewable resources or variable resources. The second one was sort of re-optimizing the portfolio of participants. And particularly for the latter, I'd be interested in sort of how much of this sort of could be incorporated in by specific transmission providers into their forecasts of use, and sort of, for lack of a better term, how much of an error band do you view this in terms of sort of what the differences are between the day ahead expected use versus the real-time actual use, such that particularly kind of highlighting the issue of we recognize the fact that, well, if we know that these rights are going to be exercised, there might be sort of efficiency benefits in not having them sort of be double, not having them be included into the EDAM market construct. So I was just wanting to sort of see what your experience was, just in terms of sort of what you viewed the sort of how much of an error really was there between sort of the day ahead anticipated use versus the real-time actual use.
Next question in the queue. Fred, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, by the way.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Fred. Maybe we can come back. I at least was hoping that, and I don't know if Ian White from Michelle would be willing to come back in, but yeah, I'd be interested if he's willing to sort of discuss those things a little more. But
yeah, why don't you let Ian go ahead, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, thanks. Isabel, do you mind jumping back to Ian real quick? He offered in the chat to comment.
I think I'm back.
Yeah, Ian, okay, great.
Great. Partha, can you just remind me of the nexus of your question quickly?
Yeah, it really was for just tying into, I think you'd highlighted some of the rationale for why participants needed sort of additional flexibility to schedule sort of after the 10 a.m. deadline. I really wanted us to explore that a little more, just in terms of sort of, for lack of a better term, what would the sort of error term be that if, in effect, if transmission, if CAISO or if the EDAM entities try to sort of model in expected transmission use from these already sold rights, how accurate do you think that would be, or is there sort of a significant gap associated with that?
Yeah, I think that would be rather difficult, because there's, I think on a garden variety day, expected use could be fairly close with actual use, but a lot of times there could be other factors that occur, outside of the Northwest region or even the West region that may affect an entity's need for the use of rights, whether that be a unit trip or moving schedules around, or inadvertent renewables or a lack of renewables. And so I think that there's sort of some, when the actuals don't meet the expected use, it's, I think, rather frequent and in terms of magnitude can be rather large. But so I think it's kind of a tale of two halves. Some of the time I think you could estimate fairly closely, but other times you would probably have a difficulty estimating, at least on the day ahead. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Really appreciate that. I'll apologize to Fred for cutting him off. So.
This is Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm having internet and phone problems here. So, I might just, if you want to go to somebody else, I'll go in through the phone, but I have to do the raise hand thing there. So I'll come back on the phone. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Fred.
Okay, let's go to Mike Whitney then.
Please go ahead.
This is Mike Whitney with the Northern California Power Agency. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. As far as remarketing bucket 2 transmission and the real-time bilateral market, indications that we're getting from EIM participants is that the real-time bilateral market is drying up. So we expect to see similar developments with the day-ahead bilateral market with Edam. So it would probably behoove the participants to make that bucket 2 available, because there's not going to be much of a market for it. And then a point to the comment about the voluntary feel of the market. Like that voluntary principle is you're either in or you're out. And if you're in for 6 months. And when you're in, the entity should put all their assets into the Edam to fully optimize the results. So I just wanted to put those 2 comments across. Thank you.
No, thank you, Mike. That's helpful feedback.
Okay, let's move to Connie.
Wiestat, Nevada Commission. This seems to me to turn firm transmission rights that customers are paying for 24/7 into use it or lose it rights, and it takes control of that if it's non-voluntary out of the hands of the customer. There is an OAT function available for those customers to post their transmission that they don't intend to use for resale. And if that function were encouraged to be utilized, you would have a firm bucket of transmission available to the market that would be transparent and known and available. I don't know that that's utilized widely now, because I don't know that there's a market for it, but in this context there may be, and maybe you could consider that.
Thanks, Connie. Maybe for clarification, and I'll let others from the ISO weigh in as well if they have questions or feedback. But just to clarify, are you really sort of highlighting the fact that operationally there are benefits to having the transmission customers to have control over those rights available, and that there are, for lack of a better term, existing processes for indicating customers that are interested to make their already purchased OAT rights available for resale? Is that your key message, Connie?
Yes, there is that function available under the OAT, and it would seem to get me to give you, if it worked, a good indication of what they wanted to provide to the market and that they didn't intend to use.
Yeah, that's helpful, Connie. Yeah, thank you for that. I see some people. I see microphones since come off at the ISO and go back on, so it's just going to maybe allow, is there anyone, the ISO, is any follow-up?
No, this is Milos, I guess, from the ISO. I think that's an interesting suggestion, maybe that, you know, within this context, if we go down this path of unscheduled transmission, you know, that could be a tool potentially that transmission providers could utilize to, you know, identify before the day-ahead market run what's that universe of potentially unused transmission. But interesting suggestion, Connie, as a potential indicator what may be unavailable using, you know, using maybe that tool that you mentioned that may identify what parties are looking to make available for resale. Thanks for that.
Okay, I think we have Fred back on the line, so let's go back to Fred.
Hi, everybody. Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Hope you can hear me okay now. I'm having internet and phone problems. So can you hear me okay?
We can, thanks.
All right, thanks. Just to go back to a kind of high-level view of the Bucket 2 issue in particular, we were part of the group of public interest organizations that submitted as under the name joint commenters, and didn't say very much about this in the comment, but I think we're pretty strongly leaning in favor of having basically a default-in approach for unused Bucket 2, but I want to add some more nuance to that. And here I'm speaking only on behalf of Northwest Energy Coalition. You know, our other colleagues may have somewhat different views, but I think this reflects our broad feeling, I think. The first thing to note is that what we're really, our view is what we're really trying to do with the EDAM is to help accelerate decarbonization of the Western grid, but also at the same time lead to higher reliability and economic benefits. So that the kind of high-level view of this, the purpose of the EDAM is really, you know, to fit into these broader objectives. At the same time, I think, especially for those of us in the Northwest, it's important not to displace existing bilateral contractual arrangements, as has been noted before, but instead, what we're really trying with the EDAM is to capture the unrealized value of transmission that's out there in a more flow-based approach. But then the question is, it's not a binary all or nothing, you know, either all flow-based or all contract-based. How can we get a complementarity between the two? And that's going to require a lot of close attention to details, pretty obviously. Now, the strategy going forward could involve, if, for example, the approach was adopted to say, you know, basically default inclusion of non-utilized Bucket 2 transmission, that will still have to obviously have exceptions, or you could take an approach that doesn't require that, but provides incentives that would help bring more of that Bucket 2 transmission into the EDAM. Or maybe more likely it'll be a combination of both. And not only that, but incentives not to the extent of providing subsidies, but rather to compensate for the full value of transmission to the wider footprint. I think that's our perspective on this. And this is necessarily going to be an evolutionary approach. We can't predict all of the things that might happen if you have a basically default-in approach with incentives and exceptions. It will need to be revised going forward. We have a lot of confidence in the ISO and the stakeholders to do that, but I think this is not, like I say, we're not seeing this as a binary decision principle, but rather a preference for inclusion of Bucket 2 transmission as much as we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. I really appreciate those comments, and I will maybe just you set up nicely for our future discussion. We're going to be touching on both of those elements, just in terms of how we might view some of those exceptions and sort of what incentives might be available for in terms of incenting participants to make that transmission available to the EDM market or schedule on it earlier. And so we're going to have some discussion on that later. So I think that's really good points, Fred, and thank you for those comments.
Okay, let's move to Doug Boccignone.
Hi, this is Doug Bochin, I'm representing the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I just wanted to comment in terms of the experience for existing rights and how they get honored. I worked for consumer utilities and consulted to them since before the ISO was formed. And, we spent a lot of time dealing with transitioning our existing contract rights to, working in an organized market model. And we had a lot of the same concerns that, have been raised by a lot of participants. And, I think the important thing to remember is that, if to the extent parties' rights are currently being met, and I hear a lot of the discussion about having to, make schedule changes between the pre-scheduling timeframe and real time. I mean, if those rights can be accommodated today, then the redispatch that we're worried about, I think is probably smaller than what people are afraid of. In other words, if there's enough transmission to deal with these schedule changes today, then there should be enough in Edam. So I think the amount of redispatch costs, I mean, the real question is how do you keep parties whole when their schedules change? And the way the ISO did it is they, provided what they called the perfect hedge, which was really just sort of reversing out congestion charges. Parties registered their contracts, they identified their resources, their sources and sinks. In the day ahead time frame, you schedule using your contract reference numbers on whatever your rights allow you to do. And then if in real time you had to make schedule changes, as long as you made those changes and used your contract reference number, the real-time congestion was reversed out. So I think for those sort of contracts that deal with specific resources with identified sinks, it's manageable, but then the transmission provider needs to have a mechanism to keep the customers whole. I think where it gets more complicated is when parties have point-to-point rights that they're using, that identify multiple points. And I think that's sort of a different class, a different potential source of issues that I would, be a little more concerned about. And I think DMM raised some of these issues in their comments. But again, I mean, if there must be limitations on how those rights are being exercised today in a bilateral world, and when they can be accommodated, they're accommodated, and when they can't, they aren't. So it seems like we ought to be able to do something similar to that in the EDAM. But this last comment, I think, yeah, you definitely want to err on the side of making the transmission available, accommodate people's rights, provide the right incentives. But I think I would be very, very concerned if we're talking about a significant portion of the transmission is going to fit into the group that has exceptions, because I think that would be problematic. So I think what would make sense is to try to identify, the volumes that we're talking about. And to the extent it's transmission that is associated with specific resources and specific delivery points, I think it's a lot more manageable.
No, thank you, Doug. Thanks for sharing some of your experiences. It's always, to me, very helpful to have feedback from people who have been through this before and have developed out some of these solutions in terms of how to manage specific risks and contracts. And so, yeah, really appreciate that perspective. Maybe I'll pause to see if there's anyone else from the ISO who has feedback or questions as follow-up.
Mike, did you have another question, or is that from your previous question?
Oh, I thought it was down.
Okay, no problem. I am seeing a couple questions in the chat, so I will read those out. The first one from Jan Strack at San Diego Gas and Electric. So, what is the reliability concern with including unscheduled transmission in bucket 2? Just because it isn't scheduled at 10 a.m. doesn't mean it isn't available. Wouldn't not including such transmission in RUC create reliability issues?
I apologize, Isabella. Could you read that question again?
Sure. It's from Jan Strack at SDG&E. So the question is, what is the reliability concern with including unscheduled transmission in bucket 2? Just because it isn't scheduled at 10 a.m. doesn't mean it isn't available. Wouldn't not including such transmission in RUC create reliability issues?
No, that's a good question. And the feedback, at least that we got from parties, was fairly open-ended in terms of what those questions would look like. But I think that the highlight, at least I would paraphrase what my interpretation of commenters were saying, was that the concern was that if you were not including that transmission in the RUC, if you were including that transmission in the RUC and then committing units, but you could imagine an example where there's a unit behind a radial line, and that you were committing a unit in the RUC process, but someone else was going to use that transmission and say wheel through the Edam footprint, such that RUC commitment wasn't available. Might that create a reliability concern? And we've been looking into that question. We think that that's probably at least would be an issue today in the market, and we haven't seen the material impact from that. But that was something that we at least would want. We wanted to recognize that parties that brought up that concern, and that we'd be looking into that further going forward. But maybe I'll pause to see if there's anyone else who wanted to raise their hand from the parties who provided those concerns. I'd be interested in if they had additional corrections they wanted to make to my description, or if they wanted to sort of add on to it. I'm hoping Jeff Nelson raised his hand to answer the question, not to ask a question. So maybe I'll.
Yeah, that was it. Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. My understanding, and Martha, maybe you said it in just a different way, is that if DMM was saying that if you're counting on transmission to be available to say RUC capacity, so you're planning on capacity being available to be able to transport RUC to it, which means transport energy if they need to dispatch it. And then after you make that RUC commitment, someone says, no, I'm just kidding, I'm scheduling my own transaction on that line. Well, that line's no longer available to provide RUC to the area that was counting on it, and that could be the potential reliability concern. That was my take on DMM's comments.
Yeah, we have the same read, and I think you articulated it better than I did, Jeff. So I really appreciate your weighing in.
Yeah, we actually supported the sort of automatic turnover of the transmission after 10 a.m. We even went further and said that people should change their tariffs going forward, that all new transactions, that's just the known rule. And then we don't have this problem going forward. It's just an issue for sort of legacy transmission contracts. And we also suggested the ISO have the right that if we are automatically turning it over and there's a problem that's being created, that on a path-by-path basis, they could sort of turn off the auto transfer. So that was a little more than you asked, but I had the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for getting into Jeff. Yeah, appreciate that.
Adam Swadley in the queue.
Hi, yeah, this is Adam Swadley from DMM. I just wanted to jump in here to, I guess, kind of confirm part of the summary and Jeff's summary also of what the comment was that DMM submitted on this issue. So basically, the concern was that if the bucket 2 transmission was made available, the unscheduled firm transmission was made available to RUC, and there was a RUC solution that depended on some of that transmission that could be later scheduled after the Edam market. That was the potential source of the reliability concern. That basically, you could have a RUC solution that depended on the transmission that was scheduled later, such that the RUC solution was no longer feasible by the time the real-time market came around. So I think that's the summary that I heard there, but I just wanted to kind of jump in and confirm that. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
We'll go to Jeff Spires.
Hi, Partha. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I've appreciated the discussion so far, and I think there's been a lot of good perspectives, and I think the Jeff Nelson's comments and the clarification from DMM make sense to me as well. In the OAT world, basically the way I would kind of characterize it is you have a firm rights holder that can choose to schedule their rights, and if they don't, then the transmission service provider can resell that transmission to another customer on a non-firm basis. And so what that allows for is that if the firm rights holder eventually does schedule on those rights, then it's clear that you have a transmission customer with lower priority, and they will be curtailed, and they know that, and there's clarity through those NERC priorities about the order of operations. And I think that that's where this gets a lot more challenging, when in effect you have the potential for what I would call multiple firm uses, or something close to that, where the market uses the transmission in a way that is firm, or is leading to a result that you want to be reliable, at the same time that the existing firm rights holder may eventually use those rights. And that's obviously a redispatch concern, but could potentially be a reliability concern if there isn't an obvious solution to resolve that double use of those rights. But just more generally, what I did want to add is I think it's worth just taking a step back. You mentioned something at the very beginning, which I think is worth noting, which is we're trying to conceptualize a market that bridges the OAT framework with the organized market structure, and that's of course something that's a challenge. And I think this question about the unscheduled use of transmission fits into a broader issue, which is just, I think, recognizing that there is a significant amount of third-party investment in the transmission system across the West. And in particular, there are some TSPs more than others, and BPA is one that's been raised earlier today, that have a significant number of customers and a significant amount of revenue that they receive from those customers to help fund the transmission system, and PowerX being one of them. And so, of course, as a transmission customer, we have our self-interest in maintaining the value of the investments we make in the transmission system. But I think it's also just worth recognizing that broadly, the third-party revenue is very large. It's easily over $1 billion a year across the West. And so I think that's something that needs to really be contemplated in the EDAM design in general, in terms of trying to ensure that the value of those rights are preserved, because that's something that's going to be necessary to help those areas, help those TSPs that have third party evaluate the market and see it as attractive, because what we would want to avoid is the risk of cost shifts. I mean, if you have third parties investing in the transmission system that don't continue to do that, those costs need to be borne by the native load in those areas. And so that's, I think, a concern. And it really comes down to being thoughtful about OAT rights. You know, how can those OAT rights be contemplated through the market design in terms of physical priority to flow and recognizing the NERC priority of those transmission rights, as well as the economic considerations associated with the cost of the transmission and redispatch costs, as well as the allocation of economic value through the congestion rent allocation discussion as well. So there are, you know, multiple facets to this discussion, but I just really wanted to emphasize that there is a significant amount of revenue from third parties that I think needs to be contemplated, and finding a way to consider that carefully is something that is very important.
No, thank you, Jeff. Those are really helpful comments on both topics, and thanks for the additional feedback as well. I really appreciate the perspectives there. And maybe I'll ask just to make sure, is there any other, there's been kind of a couple of different dialogues. I just want to make sure that if there's anyone from the ISO who want to weigh in, both either on the reliability questions or anything in terms of Jeff Spire's additional comments, that they have the opportunity to weigh in as well. Okay, thanks. Well, thanks again, Jeff. I noticed that Kevin Smith has his hand raised. I don't know if there's additional calls, but I want to make sure that he had the opportunity to speak too.
Hey, Parth, Kevin Smith with Bank. Yeah, I've been hand up, hand down, hand up. So trying to figure out when's the appropriate time. But I really appreciate all the thought that's going into this. And I agree a lot of what Jeff just said. And I guess what we're trying to figure out here is, you know, the lesser of evils, you know, trying to come up with a concept that the market optimization brings significant value to all market participants. And so having more transmission available is a overall market benefit. And I look at the investment in transmission, and again, you know, I represent entities that have transmission and they rely on that transmission revenue. However, you know, most of that revenue is recovered through, you know, native load and you know, ongoing resource adequacy and RS types of obligations. And that is not going to go away. And I would say over time, it's going to probably become more robust with RAP and even, you know, as we go forward, as Jeff Nelson, not Jeff Spires, mentioned about, you know, changing OATs on a forward basis. Well, I think, you know, how we do our procurement and RA and other things should also be on the table. How do we ensure that, you know, long-term transmission is being procured, things of that nature. So I think, you know, we're going into a challenging, you know, world. It's you know, it's neither fish or fowl. So there will be a little bit of titration. We're not going to get it exactly right. But my assumption, and this is where all these other discussions are helpful, is that sort of what Doug said. I think for the most part, we should be able to protect the value of that transmission to the customer by continuing to allow that schedule to be honored, you know, into real time. And there will be occasions, I suppose, maybe there are infeasibilities. There are derates that occur on point-to-point transmission that would make even a point-to-point right infeasible in certain circumstances. But for the most part, I would think that the vast majority should not be a problem. And to the extent that we see a significant day coming, We know we're going to have high temperatures. There's going to be constraints on the system. You know, those are days that I would think parties would be doing pre-scheduling and trying to get as much locked down and not leaving things into, you know, the uncertainty of the real-time market. And that's kind of what we should be encouraging anyway. So I don't see a complete incompatibility. I do think there may need to be, and we're going to talk about other issues like allocations and all that. And I think that some concerns of customers, transmission customers, have been raised, and I think they're valid, and we need to really process through, because I've kind of, in our decision tree, it's kind of like, yes, make it available after 10 a.m., redispatch to ensure that the customer has her rights preserved. What we do below that line, there should be a lot of discussion. And even, you know, we're not talking about hurdle rates, but are there other ways of incentivizing? I think all those things should be on the table, but I don't want to overstate this problem. And even in EIM, we've seen massive changes where parties were used to scheduling it to T-20. We changed that, at least in our footprint. And, you know, it turned out the parties were just kind of doing it for the most part because they could. But, you know, they made adjustments. I think people will have to make adjustments as we move into a new market. It's not, you know, going to be without, you know, creating new business rules and new things. But hopefully within that construct, you know, it doesn't undermine the values that Jeff Spires was just expounding upon. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I do think we have some work to do.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, really appreciate your feedback and perspectives as well. Maybe just one follow-up, and this might be really sort of the tie-in between Jeff Spires, and you'd include the comment as well. Do you have a sense of today, sort of what percentage, at least in the systems you work with, might be sort of bucket 2 versus bucket 1 or bucket 3, or for lack of a better term, is most of the transmission being procured likely to be procured to meet the RSE needs, or is it really a significant portion that would be bucket 2? Do you have any sort of sense of sort of rough magnitudes of the transmission that sort of might fall into those different buckets?
We unmute Kevin Smith again.
Hi, sorry about that. I couldn't unmute. I think it's going to really vary significantly. And so, for example, for us, I don't see a massive amount of concern. However, I mean, I understand that Bonneville has very complex, and so, you know, so again, you know, this whole design has to be flexible enough for a transmission service provider to work with unique circumstances, and there will have to be certain exceptions. You just can't make a black and white rule around this, because there will be unique circumstances, certain providers, but for us, not as big of a hurdle to overcome as I granted an entity like a Bonneville. But that doesn't mean we can't find a solution.
Yep, that's really
maybe
helpful.
others may have a thought on that. Some other EIM entities that, you know, currently are considering this the direction that they prefer. I don't know if there's others who want to jump in.
No, thank you, Kevin.
Okay, let's move to Todd Ryan.
Hi, this is Todd Ryan with PG&E. Hey, Partha, thank you for all the info on this. I'm thinking at this from the market perspective, and I think it's safe to assume that different transmission owners or operators are going to be doing this, allowing this late scheduling to varying degrees, right? Some may not be doing it at all. Some might be leaning on it allowing late scheduling quite a bit. And to that extent, if either option creates increased costs to the market, either phantom congestion or uplift, it would seem equitable to me to be able to try to find the method that can help provide the right incentives for these individual balancing areas of transmission owners that are causing these extra additional costs to reduce them and not shift them towards those that aren't causing this additional cost. So do you get a sense from the two methods which ones are which type of cost uplifts or is more directly related or kept closer into the TO or more easily allocated to provide the incentive to align schedules?
I think that's a good question, Todd. And I don't know myself. I'll open it up to others, either at the ISO or external, who might want to respond to your question.
This is James Lynn. I'm a senior advisor for market settlement design. Can you restate that question? I think I missed part of it.
Yeah, my question kind of boils down to assume that N-1 balancing areas in the region where everyone was on time and you only had one balancing area or transmission owner doing this, that in creating either phantom congestion or creating uplift costs, representing the cost associated with the two different methods of either not scheduling it or scheduling it and dealing with the uplift. Which of those two options creates a cost that's more easily attributable to that transmission owner or balancing area, or is more isolated to that balancing area region to provide the appropriate incentive to align schedules?
I'm not sure if they're easily distinguishable without having to do some more research on it. But if the transmission is not provided and then you come into real time and then provide the transmission and schedule on it, I would think that would reduce the redispatching cost versus having it provided, being it used by as unscheduled, and then using it for your own rights. You can not necessarily identify all the redispatch costs, but what you can identify is congestion rents and transfer revenue associated with the use of that additional transmission by the transition customer. Because the real-time market, we're going to re-optimize, and so the real-time redispatch cost is going to be embedded across all of the EIM BAAs and not necessarily going to be easily identifiable to be the cause by someone using their transmission. I know it's not a good answer, but it's an accurate answer.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and if that's something you can think about further in the design process, about sending the right incentive to align schedules and which option provides the right, or is more easily creates an incentive for alignment of schedules, that'd be appreciated. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions over the phone?
We do not at this point.
Okay.
Isabella, I was gonna make a suggestion, and I'd be interested in your feedback on this. Would it make sense to take at least a 5-minute stretch break at this moment? I know people have been on the phone for coming up on an hour and 40 minutes, and so I think this might be a good time to pause for a second before moving on to the rest of the presentation. Yep. Thank you, Isabella, and yeah, I really appreciate the robust discussion. That was really informative, and So it might be a little strange to go to some of the examples at this point since we've had such a good discussion about the redispatch costs and some of the options, but we have a variety of participants on the phone just in terms of their experience with uplift costs. So I wanted to walk through sort of some really simplistic examples just to really give kind of a high level feel for how these uplift costs could be created in some of the trade-offs. And these are certainly very simplified. There's a lot of moving parts just in terms of market prices, efficiency issues, and it's really not supposed to be highlighting that uplifts are bad. It's just a level set with sort of the broader audience on how these uplifts could be created. So when we move to the discussion on allocation, we can have a more of a fruitful discussion. So if you wouldn't mind flipping to slide 18. So this slide, and I'll walk through this slowly. I want to make sure that folks are able to follow it. It's really kind of highlighting sort of two different timelines. One's in one day ahead market where transmission is fully available, and then moving into real time where potentially, existing contract holders of those rights are actually executed, and that sort of leads to congestion and congestion costs between the day that are different in the real-time market and day ahead. So for the sake of this example, again, very simplified, we have two generators. We have a relatively cheap generator at node B that has 50 megawatts bid. We have a more expensive, that node B is $10, and node A, we have a more expensive generator, where we assume there's a $100 a megawatt hour cost for the generation at node A. And then we have a load at node A of 10 megawatts. And so day ahead, at least the kind of the simplistic solution is really saying, well, from a least cost dispatch, we're going to basically commit and run the generator at node B, and that we have the results at the bottom really sort of from a real-time settlement perspective, or sorry, from a day-ahead perspective, we're going to dispatch node B, and the prices at both node B and node A are going to be $10, reflecting the incremental cost associated with serving that load at node A. And so that's kind of the step one coming out of day ahead. And that in real time, at least what we're assuming here is that, now we have that transmission being exercised between the day ahead and real-time market run. And for the sake of this example, I'm assuming that basically the transmission capacity that this ETC holder, I'm assuming, is sort of wheeling through the system. It's not using the generation node B, it's not serving load at node A, but basically causing a reduction in the ability to use that transmission between in the real-time market. And that sort of what would occur if this were in fact to happen would be that instead of solely using the generator at node B, now we can only use 5 megawatts of the $10 generator at node B, and that we would have to turn on and commit the generator at node A. We're assuming that for that additional 5 megawatts to serve the load at node A, we would have that the cost of that generation would be $100. And so in terms of the results in the bottom, we kind of walk through how the day ahead and real-time settlements would work. And that sort of in the day ahead market was really showing that, in the day ahead, sort of following that column, the day ahead market, generator A has 0 settlement because it wasn't turned on. Generator B would be paid $100, and the load would basically pay $100. So for day ahead, everything is square in terms of the settlement implication. In real time, in this simplified example, we're basically showing that we're going to basically having to ramp up the real time, the generator at node A in real time, and that basically for that 5 megawatts, the clearing price would be $100, and so we'd have basically a $500 settlement paid $500 payment to that generator. For generator B, we'd actually, we're assuming that there's congestion in a separate LMP at node B. They're setting the price still at $10. And so for the real-time settlement would basically be ramping down generator, and they sort of buy back their position. And so the market would be credited in real time $50. But that difference between the real-time payment to generator A and that real-time credit to generator B would basically mean that we, along with the settlement to load, would mean we'd have on net in this sort of simplified example, have a $450 uplift cost that would need to be, that we need to figure out how to fund in some way. And so I'm going to move to the next example just because it sort of parallels it. Is that, you know, is that really this is kind of the flip side, which is really kind of highlighting sort of potential inefficiency caused by holding back transmission rights in the day-ahead market if they're not ultimately scheduled in real time. And that sort of in this example, we kind of flip where the day-ahead market and real-time market is. And so if we assume that in the day-ahead market, sort of looking at that middle area, that if we're basically assuming that that ETC, if it's not made available for the market, we're not going to optimize it. It could be the case where day-ahead, what we're doing is we're basically saying, well, there's only 5 megawatts of transmission capacity between node A, between node B and node A. And so we're basically going to restrict the flows from node B to node A and commit that generator at node A in order to serve that incremental 5 megawatts of load. In real time, if that transmission capacity is actually available and not utilized by these transmission customers, it might be the case that that congestion as well as that commitment wasn't necessary of the generator at node A, which can lead to that idea of the phantom congestion that was being described, as well as sort of an inefficient commitment and dispatch of resources day ahead. And so I know that there's probably a lot of people who will sort of, that sort of the details of this and sort of the settlement codes and everything else are a lot more complicated, but at least for the sake of sort of that broader audience, I wanted to provide sort of a description in terms of what those what those trade-offs look like in terms of potential uplift cost as well as sort of inefficiencies caused by holding back transmissions between the in the day-ahead market. So, and before we take questions, I might move to the next slide as well. And this is one that I'm going to turn in a moment to James Lynn to provide a sort of a little more color just in terms of sort of what we're looking at. In the subsequent slides, just to maybe preview them, we're going to discuss a little bit in terms of sort of some of the alternatives that we've discussed or internally and with participants in terms of how might those EDAM entities sort of look to allocate these uplift costs as well as other ways to sort of incentivize either the customers to make those transmission rights available or to at least indicate the use of them prior to that 10 a.m. deadline. And so this slide really kind of highlights what I think has been discussed at length already, just in terms of the EDAM entities needing to consider how to allocate those costs, as well as sort of the CAISO's current position on wanting to leave it up to each EDAM entity and their stakeholders to best determine how those uplift costs may arise, particularly given the various arrangements in different EDAM entities to date. But James, I think that sort of one of the questions that has sort of come up that I thought James might be able to expand on is in terms of sort of what's the data that's being made available, what do we have, and what can we share with these different EDAM entities that would help them to develop a equitable cost allocation process that So yeah, James, maybe I'll turn to you if you wanted to add or expand on it.
Thanks, Partha. And we'll see how my computer does with the video. Usually locks up. So, but one of the things I started to address this a little bit earlier with identifying what is redispatch cost versus basically providing the cost of congestion associated with the transfers. Redispatch cost, because you're going from day ahead to real time, there is so many conditions that can change. You can have outages, you can have rebidding, you have expanded area, that the overall redispatch, identifying it associated to the use of an ETC toll rights is almost virtually impossible. But what we can identify is any congestion related to it when I provide the perfect hedge to those ETC toll rights. So we can potentially limit it to that as the something that the EDAM entity can make determination if these are uplift costs that need to be passed on or redistributed some other way. But with regards to what's available, currently what the ISO does, the settlement system, it provides you with an SD-related information. So if we associate all these transfers, ETSRs, with the EDAM entity, then the EDAM entity, one, would have to schedule them, but two, would also have the ability to see all of the interactions at the transfer locations between day ahead and real time, and they have a much better opportunity to determine what they would be considering redispatch costs. However, if we do ever go down the route of breaking these out and then providing transmission customers with specific ETSRs and not aligning them all with the EDAM entity, then what's going to happen is I'm going to give it aggregate information. So what I mean by aggregate, let's say I have 3 ETSR pairs, 2 of them are related to ETC's TORs. When I provide the information to the EDAM entity for these 3, you'll have 2 different information. One will be your individual one, which is the, let's say, RSE1 transfer. And then the 2 ETSRs pairs associated with bucket 2 would come as an aggregate. I'll give you the aggregate flow. I'll give you aggregate congestion perfect hedge dollars. So you have an aggregate information, not individual information, to break it down to which customer exercised each right, which is one of the reasons why we are leaning toward having all these ETSR pairs associated with the EDAM entity so they can have all the resource-specific information and transfer revenue information and congestion rent information. And I'm going to leave that open for any questions after that.
No, thanks, James. And maybe you had a lot of important substance there, and I think that we certainly should allow participants to get back and discuss it. I might skip through the next 2 slides really quickly, and then sort of, James, if you could stand by, we can maybe get back to sort of specific questions people have on your issue. But
my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, James. And so I'm going to go through these slides, the next 2 slides, fairly quickly, and then I'm going to open it up for the phone, because really I think what we're looking at doing here through this discussion is really kind of, while earlier we clarified that we're looking to allow each separate EDAM entity and transmission provider discretion, at least with it, discretion to have their own stakeholder process subject to regulatory review in terms of how those transmission costs will be allocated what works for their customers given their unique circumstances. We wanted to at least sort of tee up and allow some sort of, tee up some ideas that could allow for comment as well as discussion by the EDM entities in terms of potential approaches that they might take in their own stakeholder process in order to how those costs could be uplifted. So just in terms of sort of teeing up, at least for more of a thought exercise, approach one was really kind of at least acknowledging the fact that, one option could be allocating sort of the attributable uplift to the entity exercising their rights when appropriate. And that, this could be sort of those rights that are exercised after a certain deadline might be allocated back to them, back to those parties sort of based on their specific tariff and obligations. But then sort of also acknowledging the fact that it could be the case that what the EDM entity is looking to do is sort of to offset those any potential uplift costs with the day-ahead congestion rents that occurred in the market. And so that was sort of one sort of possible approach that EDM entities could look at. Sort of a second approach that we've discussed internally and with other folks could be allocating attributable uplifts and redispatch costs to all transmission customers in the EDM areas, and potentially using congestion resulting from bucket 1, 2, and potentially 3 to offset those potential redispatch uplift costs, regardless of cause, and not really tracking them back on a one-to-one basis. So those are sort of two approaches. And then we really were wanting to sort of tee up sort of more of a broad question of, are there other ways that participants looking at sort of incenting transmission customers to turn over transmission to the EDAM, or for the transmission customers to inform the ISO in advance of use prior to the day-ahead market run in order to minimize uplift costs. And that, one of the things that we discussed, and it wasn't necessarily our primary, was there certain times where the ISO might directly interface with the transmission customers. And so one possible example was if the transmission customer were to sort of turn over their transmission on a longer term basis, might it make more sense and might there be a process for the ISO to settle directly with the transmission customer associated with the transmission congestion provided from the rights it turned over. So that was sort of one option, but there might be other ones. And so we were very interested in hearing more about what participants thought in terms of potential approaches that could be taken to both incent behavior as well as to make sure that the existing rights that were defined weren't degraded. So at least in terms of the final slide, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions, just because I think that's been really helpful. This last slide is really sort of acknowledging the fact that that this is likely to be a learning process even after the EDM starts. And so for either approach, we've been trying to think about how might we monitor sort of the exercise of firm transmission rights between day ahead and real time, which were previously unscheduled, as well as, if we're looking at sort of, if we went the route of sort of say having only voluntary turned transmission rights being optimized in the market as a way to sort of monitor the phantom congestion and inefficiencies associated with doing that. Or I think and this is I think something that Jeff Nelson had sort of highlighted as a part of their proposal earlier, might be their way that we need to sort of continue to look at whether or not the uplift costs for certain transactions warrant excluding them from the market and being able to have that flexibility in order to ensure that we're able to sort of accommodate those rights that are, or sort of recognizing those rights day ahead that are leading to significant uplifts between day ahead and real time. And so those are really some of the things that we're sort of teeing up in terms of sort of as the ongoing process for transmission, things that we might look at. So I'll stop there, and Isabella, maybe we can open up the phone line to see if there's comments or questions that participants have on this set of topics.
Sure. Yeah, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing the raise hand icon located on the right-hand side of your screen above the chat window. But if you dialed into the meeting separately and did not connect to audio through the WebEx, you'll need to press #2 to enter the queue. So Yossi, do we have anyone on the phone line?
We do not.
I'm not seeing anyone over the WebEx either, and I'm not seeing any chat.
Well, maybe we give it another second before we move forward. It seems that, yeah, maybe people took a longer break than expected, but well, we can circle back to it on the end if people have follow-up questions. Maybe for the sake of time, we'll continue to move forward, and I'll turn it over to Deb to sort of lead the implementation discussion. But yeah, I wanted to, on this section, I really wanted to thank people for their active participants in terms of those policy considerations. I recognize that these are, I think as people have recognized, complex topics that we're moving forward with, trying to bring together sort of multiple paradigms, different paradigms under the OAT, as well as sort of trying to fit them into a ISO EDAM structure. And so, yeah, I really wanted to say, yeah, thanks again for the robust policy discussion in terms of those trade-offs. And if people have questions at the end, I'm really happy to circle back to them, but maybe I'll turn it over to Deb for now.
Thanks, Partha. And actually, before we move on, a question popped up from Jeff Nelson. Do you want to address that before we move into the next item?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. I was a little slow on the draw, but thanks for taking the question. I just wanted to reiterate something that I said earlier, that like Partha says, the learning, true, but the concept of phasing this issue out and having people change their tariffs as part of joining EDAM, I mean, to the extent that people's tariffs say that, look, you got to have your stuff in by 10 a.m. and that's just it, then this issue really goes away. So I really want to put that back on the table, that the benefits of that people that join make a commitment to change their tariffs or business practices. It may depend on the people, that those are just the new rules. I think that helps us become a transition issue, and I think that's a little more manageable. Also, we put in our comments, we need to honor existing contracts. We think that's really important, just as a business process, and just a community needs to honor their contracts. So I am a little concerned about proposals that would put costs on transmission owners that exercise something that was allowed under their contractual right. I think those costs, they shouldn't fall directly on that transmission, the person that's got that transmission contract. I think that's not consistent. If their existing contract immunize them from costs, I don't think they should see costs now, just as a philosophy. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jeff, and thanks for that clarification as well. Maybe I'll pause to see if anyone has any response, given Jeff's sort of additional comments. I think that they were, yeah, very, very helpful.
Well, I did want to add something that Jeff said. Is one of the things that these long-term existing rights, and I think Debbie's going to get into this more detail, is providing them with the perfect hedge. And that's one of the things that we are going to be able to provide to the EDAM entity, is when I have someone executed their rights and we provide them the perfect hedge. That is the congestion reversal that I was referring to, that is going to be made available and would be available for determination if that's considered a redispatch cost or not.
No, thanks, James. At least I'll build off and respond to Jeff as well. That I think that we recognize as well that it's, and every market transition, this issue of respecting contracts and holding is certainly a important issue for FERC and the redesign as well. And I think it certainly is a topic that we're going to be discussing at length as we move forward in terms of how do we best do that. So, yeah, really, Jeff, really appreciate your comments and feedback.
Looks like we have another question from Kevin Smith.
Thank you, Kevin Smith Bank. I just wasn't sure I understood what Jeff was saying. I just want to be clear. So as I understood it, as a condition precedent for an EIM entity now moving to an EDAM entity, they would have to just make a prospective rule in their open access tariff that the scheduling deadline is 10 a.m. And after 10 a.m., there is no redispatch. You use it or lose it. And did I understand that? And if that's the case, I do not think that's going to fly on day one at all. I think that, we're going to need to understand and get a better handle on what, how this market responds, what kind of uplifts and other things. We may need to have some circuit breakers or other things in there if these costs ended up becoming, out of control or have some other mechanism. But I think it's going to be hard to get EIM or EDAM entities, at least that I know of, to say, I will stipulate on day one that my oath's going to be prospectively amended. That's going to effectively require a party to participate by 10 a.m. Now, it could be a stretch goal or something that as we review how the market's performing, I can see kind of moving in a direction. This is going to change how we do business. There's just no way around it, and it should, or else it's not really doing much. But maybe I didn't understand Jeff what Jeff Nelson was raising.
Could be. I think Jeff has his hand up, so maybe we can allow him to respond.
That's what I was hoping.
Yeah, sort of yes, sort of no to your understanding. Ideally, yes, that as a condition for joining, there'd be the tariff agreement to amend that schedules needed to be submitted on prospective transmission sales. So it needed to be submitted by 10 o'clock. And then there really not a provision to make schedule changes afterwards. Maybe there's emergency provisions or something, exceptions, but not just sort of economic provisions to just make changes. It's just not allowed. Now, you use the term use it or lose it. I don't like that term because my mind is that you either schedule on it or you capture the congestion rents that EDAM populates. So it's not that it's sort of taken away from you, it's that you've converted it into EDAM rents. So you really haven't lost it, you've gotten paid for it based on the EDAM rents. Now, I haven't really thought through on, okay, so you've kind of got day ahead congestion and real-time congestion. I've always just thought you'd get the day ahead congestion. I haven't really thought about what happens if there's a difference between day ahead and real-time congestion. Maybe that's something to talk about. And also sort of the condition for joining. Ideally, yeah, be, day one, have that tariff changed. That might not be practical. It might be something that's sort of like, okay, you've agreed that you will have your tariff changed within an X time frame, and I don't know what that X is. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year and 6 months, because it may not be practical or feasible to change your tariff immediately. Hope that clears it up, Kevin.
Yeah, it does, Jeff. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, I do think it would be, a little bit challenging. It may not be for all entities, but I wouldn't want to see this as like the barrier that keeps an entity from participating, and it creates chaos in their own internal. Because remember, all these entities are going to have to go not only to their own commissions, they're going to have FERC approvals, but they're also going to have stakeholder processes. And, you know, this, you've already heard the other side of the coin, you know, and, you know, they have a lot of valid issues. So anyway, I think all these issues need to be fully vetted though. And so I appreciate, you know, you raising it. I think there's a lot of things on the allocation side that we may need to think about as well that may go beyond just the way CAISO's laid out, but I think those are more discussions that we're trying to have internally and figure out what's the best mechanism. But anyway, thanks for the clarification.
Yeah, just one thing, footnote to that. So people may find themselves in very, very spectrum situations. And maybe some people that they're already basically executing their tariffs that way. And it might just be a clarification in business practices. And, you know, in an extreme, it might apply prospectively and retroactively, depending on how they've set up the rules today. And then other people, it may be a much larger deal. You know, as this conversation goes, maybe there is sort of a hybrid that you commit to fix this problem going forward, or if you don't, then there's allocation the uplift is allocated right to the transmission provider, and now they can sort of choose their I won't say poison, choose their vitamin, if whether they want to commit to not allowing this going forward, or if they want to commit to pay for it and keep the practice going. Now that wasn't in our comments, but that's just a thought as this discussion's happened.
Looks like another question just popped in.
That sounds great.
Hi, this is Henry Tillman with NIPSI. I'm sort of listening to this, and I guess, you know, there's a lot of discussion about how this is impacting EDAM entities, but I don't hear a lot of sort of discussion back to, you know, the points that were raised in the very beginning of the call around, you know, how will, you know, independent generators in EDAM entities, what is the incentive for them to turn over their transmission? And if it's being turned over automatically, what is the incentive for them to continue to pay for those rights? I'm just not following this. And I think the other issue is a lot of the you know, with the focus on EDAM entities, a lot of the independent generation in the Northwest is actually in generation-only balancing areas that are not participating in the EIM. And, you know, what is the incentive for them to participate in EDAM?
No, thank you, Henry. Maybe I would have some responses and questions back, but maybe I'll allow anyone else at the ISO to respond first if they want to weigh in.
This is Mark Rothleader. I'll weigh in here a little bit. I think we have this same tension in California when we went initially with the original MRTU market, and I think this sense of what is it your rights provide to you? I guess the answer to that question is really, in the first place, the rights do allow you to participate in the day-ahead market and be able to be, you should be able to be confidently hedged for use, and that gives you the confidence that you can use those rights to schedule your day-ahead transactions. I think that's primary. Now, this question about, okay, what do your rights allow you to use post day ahead? I think that's where it gets into this little messy discussion about what happens after the day ahead, and if you use those rights, what happens to the dispatch costs. And I think we need to continue to work on that. Again, not to circumvent the rights you have, but to ensure that those rights are being honored. I don't think we've ever said that they couldn't be scheduled. They should be able to be scheduled. But then how do you what's the proper level of installation and expectation after that point? I think that needs to be further clarified and addressed. But I think in the first place, you acquire those rights because you want to be able to have confidence that you can use those to deliver your generation. Is that, am I misunderstanding the intent of what those rights were acquired for?
You might want to unmute Henry.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I think that's right, but if I can participate in the EDAM simply by bidding my generation in and relying on transmission in one of the other three buckets, I'm not sure why I would continue to pay for transmission that would be eligible for bucket 2.
Because I don't think that gives you, that doesn't, I guess if you did it that way, that alone would not give you the financial hedge and the confidence that you could potentially even self-schedule, not being concerned about the price differential.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that it's effectively creates a death spiral for people, making decisions about holding long-term rights on transmission. If the EDAM is going to be dispatching the generation anyway, why would I pay to continue to support the transmission system? I'm just not seeing that generators would stay in that market.
Yeah, I think it's a mechanism to allow you the confidence that you can deliver that generation and get and not be concerned about the congestion prices at least stay ahead. So I think that is the replication of what a right gets you in a marketplace like this. This is why, I don't want to divert the conversation, but this is why would people go get CRRs in our market is because they value the hedge it provides, and that's kind of the equivalent of what this is providing you. It provides you that hedge so you can have confidence that you can deliver your generation and get to the market. Anyway, I think we can have a sidebar discussion if you'd like to discuss further, but I just wanted to at least respond to your question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Henry. Appreciate it.
Do you have any other questions?
We do not.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Deb Levine. I'm the Director of Infrastructure Contracts and Management at the California ISO, and pretty much been involved with existing contracts before the ISO existed, because I was one of the rights holders at a local utility before the ISO came into being. So what I'd like to do here is go through and just walk through very, a little bit of detail, but high level, what does it take to register transmission rights? How do you exercise those transmission rights? And then how does the market know that you have the rights, and what exactly is the perfect hedge? So next slide, please. So for registering transmission contracts, and we've had, based on the discussions with this group and the other participants, we've had a number of discussions internally, and what we think is going to work the best is if you have transmission rights that are 1 month or greater, because it takes about 10 business days to get the data into master file to get it to work. We're thinking about a 1 month cutoff. So if your transmission rights are a month long and you get them, you know, a month or two in advance, or they're 20-year rights, then what you would do is you'd fill out what we call the transmission rights, transmission curtailment instructions, or TRTC. And that's a spreadsheet that goes through and it asks you what rights you have. Is it network? Is it point to point? Is it, you know, what points do you have the rights to get across to? What are your sources and sinks? How many megawatts you have? If it is network, is it the same amount of megawatts to each one of the sources and sinks? Are there any conditions on it? Is it on peak, off peak, 24/7? It takes all of that information. It's a nice, really well laid out multiple tab Excel spreadsheet that would be filled out by the Edam entity, whoever sold the transmission service. And then what would happen is that they would coordinate with the transmission customer that, yes, you know, I agree, those are the rights that I have. That's what's intended to be saved, in essence, as part of my existing contract rights. Then the Edam entity would go ahead and give that spreadsheet to the CAISO, and the CAISO goes ahead and will put in a contract reference number for each, in essence, contract line item. So you might have, if you have a network right, and you can go from 3 different sources to 5 different points of delivery, you'd in essence have 15 different lines, and so you'd have 15 different contract reference numbers to go ahead and handle each one of the combinations between each one of the generators and each one of the point of delivery. And then that contract reference number, depending upon who's going to be doing the scheduling for the entity, whether it's the, you know, local utility underneath the Edam entity or the Edam entity is going to be doing it, then they would use that contract reference number when you want to exercise those rights. And the contract reference number will ensure that you're not charged for congestion or for transmission. You've already paid for transmission, and you won't pay for congestion because your rights are, in essence, have a higher priority than the rights of the market to use that transmission. And as I said, the TRTC instructions are going to be provided to the CAISO, and we'll include those in the master file. Next slide, please. If the rights are less than 1 month, what's going to end up happening is we will be developing a registration system that will go ahead and allow you to put in the same type of information and integrate that into the system so that we can go ahead and have that available in cyber. We haven't figured out quite yet because we haven't built it, and haven't designed it yet. But the intent is that it would be available, you know, at least a day or two in advance. We'll have to see if it is something that would be available later than that. But it'll have the same thing: point-to-pointer network. What are your transmission rights? How many megawatts? What's the start date and the end date for the contract? What's the latest time able to submit the schedule? Does it impact an intertie, or is it just transmission within an Edam entity? All of that information would be included. And again, it would be the transmission owner, somebody who sells the transmission, and the customer agreeing to what all of those facts are regarding the contract. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me, before I discuss exercising those rights, I wasn't sure if I had one more slide or not. I didn't get a chance to print this out in advance. So does anybody have any questions about how you would go ahead and let us know what transmission rights you have? And I see one of our people internally has questions. What's the schedule for posting the template with our responses? Oh. for the TRTC instructions is actually, I believe, already on the web. If not, it's already available. So any of the people who are thinking about EDAM entities, becoming an EDAM entity, they can go ahead and get a hold of the ISO. It's not it's a public document, and it tells you how to fill it out. If it's helpful to post it, we can go ahead and post that as early as anybody might like it. So Isabella, I don't see any questions.
Yeah, as a reminder, if you have a question or would like to ask one, you can press the raise hand icon above the chat window, or if you connected to audio separately outside the WebEx, you can do so by pressing #2. We'll give it a minute, see if anyone enters the queue.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and talk about exercising your rights. So now you already have established a contract reference number. So you want to go from generator 1 to load 1. And while you have contract rights, let's say for 100 megawatts, you want to only use 75 megawatts. So what you would do is you'd still use that contract reference number, and you'd use 75 megawatts to get from generator 1 to load 1. And that's what you put in the day-ahead market. The day-ahead market will go ahead and say, oh, I see this contract reference number. It's matched. You've got 75 megawatts at the generator, 75 megawatts at the load. That's the self-schedule in the market. Yes, that contract reference number exists in the master file system. I see it. So therefore, you will not be charged for the day-ahead market for the transmission cost and the congestion because you've exercised those rights. And let's say you go into real time and it turns out you need another 20 megawatts of that 100 megawatt contract. Then in real time, you go ahead and you, again, self-schedule. You already have 75 megawatts. It's already scheduled in the day ahead. That will roll over to real time. And then in real time, you'll go ahead and add in an additional 20 megawatts. You still haven't gone over the 100, so you're fine. You'll still be hedged for the transmission cost or congestion. And it's the redispatch cost that we've been talking about so far quite a bit in this afternoon's presentation is what is going to be the additional costs, and how those are allocated is still what's being discussed. But your transmission rights can be exercised in both day ahead and in real time. In both instances, you will be able to go ahead and hedge the cost of the congestion and the cost that you've already paid for the transmission. So I think it was Henry asked the question in the last segment, why would I want to keep my long-term contract if I can just get it out of the market? Well, what ends up happening is if you get it out of if you don't have this contract, then you'll have to pay the congestion and the transmission cost, and there will still be transmission costs in order to use the market. So you would end up paying what California calls new firm use charge, which is at the moment about $16 per megawatt hour. And then you have to pay the congestion between generator 1 and load 1. Your transmission rights can be exercised across the 24-hour. If they're only for on-peak rights, off-peak rights, whatever their contract is for, then that's what you're allowed to use. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the ETSRs over to James. Yeah, okay, James is still on the call. James is going to go through the ETSRs. He's been working with George on that. So I'll leave that part of the discussion up to him. James, it's all yours.
Thanks, Debbie. Hello, everybody. What I wanted to do here is describe a little bit of how we currently establish ETSRs and how they are going to expand into the EDAM market. Now, in WEAM, what we do is as a balancing authority area is onboarding into WAM, we establish what's called ETSR pairs. And what it is we'll talk to the balancing authority area coming on, as well as to the other balancing authority area with which it is transferring energy to. And you create two resource IDs. One is the main tagging resource ID, and the other one is called a mirror resource ID. This tells us what are the transfer resources associated with each of those balancing authority areas. And with it, we indicate what is the transmission line limit associated with these transfer resources. With Edam, we're going to expand that concept into the Edam, and it's going to allow us to create multiple ETSR pairs at transfer locations. You potentially could do it as a single one if you want to incorporate all of the transfer energy under one ETSR pair, or you potentially could split it out between what the RSC1 transmission and potentially bucket 2 transmission, and even bucket 2 could be broken down even further. Now, what we would have to establish is what is the pair both in the pair balancing authority areas, what is the limit within those balancing authority areas, and then when it comes to telling us what is the amount of available transmission that the EDAM market is going to use, we can do it in one of two ways. We can have it where each of the ETSR pairs, and it's usually the EDAM entity, will be the one providing us with this information, would tell us this is available transmission for this particular ETSR. We would have both balancing authority areas tell us what their available transmission is. So let's have the ETSR pair 1, which is ETSR 1 in BAA1, ETSR 2 in BAA2. ETSR 1 provides a transmission of 400 megawatts. ETSR 2 says they have available transmission on this ETSR of 300. That means we now have a limit for that ETSR pair of 300 megawatts. So when the market solves, that'll be the limit it's going to use for that ETSR pair. You could do that with each of the individual ETSR pairs, or a second option is to provide available transmission capacity for your group of ETSR pairs, basically a group transmission capacity, and then we will compare it to the group transmission capacity on the other side again and do have that limit. And then when the market solves, it will use the ETSR or available transmission capacity for the whole grouping to ensure that when we send energy from one balancing authority area to another, that we don't exceed those available transmission limits. Can we go to the next slide if there is one?
That is the last slide.
Okay. So now once we know what the available limit is, the market will solve. And then with this, it will break down each of the net transfer into the individual pairs. So I will know, let's say I have 3 pairs, and we have the total limit 800 megawatts, and it's 100 for ETSR pair 2, 200 for ETSR pair 3, and then the balance 500 goes into the RSE1. As we're solving it, we get up to a total of 700 megawatts that's transferred. We will have to have ability to be able to distribute it across those 3 ETSR pairs. And again, this comes down to which method do you use to provide this available ATC. If you do it as aggregate, then it'll be more likely pro rata distributed unless we have a nominal hurdle rate to give us priority. Otherwise, if you give us for each of the individuals, we will then do the distribution based upon each of those ETSR pairs and how much is used by self-schedule versus being used by the market. And I don't know if anybody have any questions on ETSR.
As a reminder, to enter the queue, you can do so by clicking the raise hand icon above the chat window or by pressing #2. Looks like we have one on the line, Todd Ryan.
Hey, James, this is Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Thanks for walking us through this. My apologies if I misunderstood, but what I basically heard you say is that you would line up ETSR pairs. Did I hear you say that it would be by bucket? So if balancing area A to B, one offered 300 megawatts of bucket one and one offered 400 megawatts in bucket one, you take the minimum, so it would be 300 megawatts for the ETSR one.
Yeah, so what we would do is not necessarily by bucket, but what you would establish is the two ETSR pairs and what the limits are for those ETSR pairs. They could be just bucket one. They could be a combination of bucket one and bucket two, but it's a specific ETSR resource. And then if you are providing the available transmission capacity of just those two resources, yes, we will limit it based upon that, because we want to make sure that each balancing authority area's available transmission capacity is observed. So in that example, we said that the ETSR for BA1, we had 400, one was at 300. The 300 is a limiting capacity. So therefore, we would have to limit it to 300 for that ETSR pair.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess what I'm concerned about is artificially limiting the ETSR. So like if we both offer a gigawatt of transfer between the two of us, and we're balancing areas, but I offer mine all as bucket one, and you offer yours all as bucket three, and we're in a $0 hurdle rate world that we're all talking about. It would seem to me that the full gigawatt of transfer capability should be recognized in that ETSR pair.
So what you're describing is what I said was the secondary option, where you provide an aggregate of the available transmission capacity across all the ETSRs at that location. But each of the individual have their own limit, but your available transmission capacity will be used across all of the ETSRs at that location. That was that second option that I offered up. Is you can have the option where you provide it by ETSR pairs, or you provide available transmission capacity across all of the ETSR pairs.
Okay, but do you understand, Mike? Do you understand the concern of kind of unrecognized capacity, if whether it's an aggregate over a whole balancing area or specific to a specific line? If it doesn't make sense to limit the ETSR pair based on the bucket one versus bucket two or bucket three if they're all in the market for optimization and available. Maybe we can take this offline, but I'm just concerned that people are going to be bidding intertie or volunteering or putting in intertie ATC to the market to optimize, and it's going to be artificially not optimized.
I hear you, Todd, and I think part of where we're talking past each other is, I did say RSE1, but that was as an example. It doesn't, the ETSR pair doesn't have to represent just bucket one. You can have it where it represents multiple levels.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
Let's move to Steve Greenleaf.
Yep. Thanks, James. Thanks, Deb. Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Just kind of following up a little bit on Todd's question. Deb, first of all, if you could just confirm in the utilization of the CRN numbers, it's not an all or nothing game, right? It's a case where a third party, a bucket two transmission rights holder could schedule using the CRN for a portion of their rights, but then for the balance of those rights, obviously depending on or subject to the outcome of resolution on, this kind of automatic use of the unscheduled rights, they could make the balance of those rights formally available to the market. Correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So I think in part getting to Todd's question and James, your discussion on this ETSR, I guess my first question is, it's the EDAM entity that's communicating that that ETSR availability, whatever you want to call it, to the ISO, right? Is that correct?
Yes, it's during the onboarding of the balancing authority area in EDAM. The EDAM entity provides us the limits and the rights. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand obviously for initial setup, but this is a dynamic thing where the ETSR levels are obviously fluctuating on a day-to-day basis, right? So I guess my question is, EDAM entity seems to be the one interfacing with the CAISO. How does a third-party transmission rights holder convey, or to whom does it convey that it's making transmission capacity available, if that makes sense? And how does that work in the context of RSE submissions at 9, running the market at 10? I don't know if that question, I hope that question makes sense, but just mechanically, I'm trying to, go ahead.
Yeah, let me, so let's say we have an ETSR pair that has ETSR's total rights on it. It has a 100 megawatt limit, and the available transmission capacity that has been provided to the market says as 100 megawatts. So the full capacity is being made to the market. But as a transmission customer, you self-schedule 80 megawatts. That 80 megawatts would receive the perfect hedge for using that transfer from one BA to the other. And then that other 20 megawatts, because it's available transmission capacity, is now available to be used by the market to transfer energy from BA1 to BA2. And then, so depending upon how that ETSR is associated with, whether it's associated with the customer or the EDAM entity, then all the transfer revenue and congestion rents associated with that ETSR perfect hedge, as well as any additional transmission being sold, would be allocated to the EDAM entity for, and be divvied out a little bit. You'll be able to tell that there's a distinguish between the 80 and the 20 for them to make a decision as to how that congestion rents would be distributed. Does that help answer your question, Steve?
In part. I mean, I fully understand what you're talking about with respect to distinguishing between reservations under using the CRN, how that protects it or provides the perfect hedge, and then the balance being made available in market. Mine is really just a timing issue on, obviously, that third-party entity is going to, let's just say, for example, 100 megawatts are right, 75 megawatts they want to use and self-schedule using the CRN. They're going to do that at 10 a.m. when they submit that into the market, correct? Right? So how does the market know, and how does the EDAM entity with whom those rights are held convey to the ISO that additional 25 is available to the market? Maybe I don't know if that makes sense, but.
So by giving us the available transmission capacity of 100 megawatts, they've told us that additional 25 megawatts are available to the market.
Okay, and when does it do? And when does it do that? When does it tell you those 100 megawatts?
Well, it's going to tell us 100 megawatts is available for whatever to cover both what you're going to self-schedule for your CRN plus the additional 25. So I'm going to know, I think it's at 9 a.m. that there is a total of 100 megawatts available on that ETSR,
Okay,
you're going
right.
to tell me by 10 a.m. how much of that is a self-schedule for your CRS.
Okay, so the EDAM entity as part at 9 a.m. tells the ISO 100 megawatts under the presumption, knowing very well that some of that 100 is, or all of it, is third-party rights. And then at 10 o'clock, the CAISO, obviously, when that third party uses those rights and schedules the 75 self-schedules, uses the CRN, carves that out, provides the perfect hedge. But that back, I was
You
driving
cut
at,
out there,
when
Steve.
is that? Oh, sorry. I think you answered my question that it's at 9 a.m. when the EDAM entity conveys the availability of that transmission to the CAISO.
Yep. It
And
tells us
that's,
how much of the ETSR is available for use.
yeah, okay. I'll have to think through it. I'm just trying to work through the relationship between the third-party rights holder, how it works with the EDAM entity, and then how the EDAM entity conveys that information to the CAISO. But I think you answered my question. Thank you.
And Steve, you're getting into some of the nuances that we do have to continue to discuss, is all of the processes and procedures into getting all that information to the ISO. But on a high, very, very, very high level, I would have the EDAM entity tell me how much transmission is available for use by the market. And then as the rights holder, you would self-schedule the amount that you're going to use, because you're going to use your CRN to say, I've got a priority self-schedule for that. And then as long as you're within your available limits, you're going to get that priority. And then whatever's left over gets to be used by the market. I don't know if Todd or Jeff want to come on next.
Yeah, let's go to Jeff.
Hi, James and Deb. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think I had a question that was somewhat similar to Steve's, maybe a little bit different, mostly related to the concept of exercising a transmission contract using the CRN. I understood the explanation around providing the congestion hedge from a financial perspective. If you submit a self-schedule and a CRN, that you would have that financial protection. But the part that I'm still not sure I fully grasp is, how is the physical priority of those rights considered through the optimization? Maybe just using like a simple example. If there is a customer that has firm rights across a path, so let's say they have NERC priority 7, and then there's another transmission user with a lower priority, let's just say they have priority 6. They both have CRNs and they both submit self-schedules associated with that path. If there's not enough transmission capability to accommodate those schedules, how does the market determine which self-schedule flows? Does the priority of those CRNs play a role in the optimization? I'm just not sure that I'm grasping that element, because the economic hedge is of course important, but another reason that entities are purchasing these rights is to be able to have that physical priority deliver their resource to their load. And I'm trying to understand how that physical element is considered through the concept of the CRN.
Debbie, do you want to answer this one?
So Jeff, if I get your question correctly, you're in essence asking, if there's a total of 1,000 megawatts between point A and point B, and it turns out 700 of it was self-scheduled in the day-ahead market, the other 300 was used by the market, so that all 1,000 is used in the day-ahead market, and then you get into real time, and the existing contract rights holder comes back and says, well, I want to use 200 out of the 300 that is mine, it's part of my existing contract. What happens? Is that the gist of your question?
Not quite. I was actually thinking something even more simple, which was just imagine it's all occurring in the day-ahead market. Let's say you have 1,000 megawatts of transfer capability across a particular path, and you have 1,100 megawatts of entities self-scheduling with different contract numbers and different priorities. And so there's not enough to award all of those schedules in the day-ahead market. Does the optimization consider the CRN and the priorities of that in determining how to award the schedules? Or that's the part that I'm not understanding.
Yeah, you couldn't have that, because if there's only 1,000 megawatts capability on the line, the transmission owner couldn't have sold more than 1,000 megawatts. Now, let's say, as an example, it's 1,000 megawatt line, but there's an outage on the line. Typically, what ends up happening is everybody has to take a pro rata cut. So to the extent that somebody schedules what would have been their percentage of the 1,000 megawatts because they didn't realize the line had an outage on it, then in essence, we would go ahead and automatically pro rata cut them to their appropriate level based on the TRTC instructions that we already have.
I think in my example, what I was getting at was that I think it is conceivable that you could have more contracts than transmission capability, at least under the OAT framework. When you start looking at the different NERC priorities, you could have a situation where there may be more contract holders when you look at rights that include not only, say, firm 7F, but also lower priority like 6 or 5 all the way down to priority 1. So you've got this possibility of more entities seeking to flow, and in the OAT world, that NERC priority would determine who flows and who gets curtailed. And so I'm trying to understand whether that would also be applicable here or how under that framework. So I mean, I certainly understand what you're describing in the context of having total contracts that don't exceed the line, but it does seem like it's a possibility that you would have different rights holders with different priorities that you would need to be contemplating.
Right, and those would be told to the CAISO as part of the TRTC instructions, so that we know that, you know, if the line is already full, if somebody did sell 1,100 megawatts out of their 1,000 megawatt line, but they have these different priorities, then in essence, part of the TRTC instructions that you give us, in essence, would say, okay, these 5 people get to use it irregardless, and then lower priorities, you know, 5, 6, 7, which you just mentioned, would get it if it's available. All that's incorporated into the TRTC instructions.
Okay, so those details could be part of that communication.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sure. We have that today on the COI, where somebody has super rights compared to other people.
Looks like another question popped in from Todd Ryan. Nope, maybe not. Okay, there is one in the chat that I'll read out. It's from David Rubin at NV Energy. So just checking that this ETSR proposal is only with respect to pre-OAT transmission rights.
I have to think about that and get back to you, David. Under quick thought, I would say yes, but I think I need to think about that and talk internally before I give you a firm yes or no.
Okay, thanks, James. Looks like Steve and Ryan, Steve and Todd just popped up in the chat again. So let's go to Steve.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got cut off before. I'll blame it on the 103-degree heat on impact on my ISP, but who knows. One thing, and I think, James, and if I need to, I'll follow up with you and Deb offline. Just, I think I understood, but you kept using about the phrase, the EDAM entity is conveying how much transmission is being made to the market at 9 o'clock, and that's not necessarily true. What they're conveying is maybe the total transfer capability on that ETSR, or the transfer capability on that ETSR, but ultimately what's available to the market is what's not utilized by the third-party customer utilizing their CRN, right? So, if that makes sense. So
yeah, we're referencing it differently, but yes. So when I was saying available transmission, it just means all the transmission is available. That a portion of it's going to be used by the transmission customer. So what you're saying, we're in agreement.
Yep. Okay. And lastly, I just wanted to kind of following off Jeff Spire's earlier comment and Henry's comment, I just wanted to kind of layer on that a little bit just to provide a perspective of where Brookfield is coming from, because clearly, you know, we own valuable transmission rights. We're part of that billion-dollar market Jeff referred to, and it's not just a case of an IPP providing. There's obviously a number of third-party load-serving entities that, i.e., load-serving entities that are not part of the, you know, the BAA serving load. And I just wanted to convey a lot of those arrangements entail contractual commitments very specific to the customer's needs, i.e., and especially delivery of GHG or clean energy. So I just wanted to put that in context, and a lot of that is subject to verification. So it's not a simple case of always just an economic decision about buying out of the market to supply. That really doesn't necessarily comport with the contractual obligations and the obligations to the customer. So it's in that broader context that party is weighing how best to use those third-party transmission rights it may possess. It's in the context of load service, but driven by and really kind of dictated by its contractual commitment. So it's not just an economic decision of, hey, on a given day we'll just buy out of the market, you know, buy out of the EDAM market for satisfying that. We need to be able to deliver, and I understand, and I completely agree with the CAISO. You know, its commitment is to honor those transmission contracts so that it can do that. But you know, as you know, it secured transmission service, you know, and I'm generally thinking in the context of point to service its customers' peak load needs. So on any given day or any given hour, the load is going to be less than that. And you may want to provide incentives for that third party to turn that transmission over to the EDAM market, yes, at compensation. So that's kind of, I just wanted to offer that perspective. I had been kind of delayed in doing that during Partha's presentation, but I wanted to convey that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, let's move to Todd.
Hi, Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. I have just one question. Going back to the late scheduling of bucket 2, so feel free to just jot this down and get back to me. But I'm curious, how, from a settlements perspective, would that transaction be handled? I mean, I assume it can't be handled as a day ahead self-schedule because the market's closed. but would it be put into the next available market, or how would it be handled?
Well, it's contemplated right now that it would be handled in real time. That you would update your self-schedule in real time, and then we will optimize around it. And that's where some of the discussions we had earlier on redispatch costs came from. You've utilized a portion of your rights in day ahead, and now you want to utilize additional amount of your rights in real time. Is there any redispatch costs associated with doing so, and how are those identified? So that's kind of where that concept comes in.
Okay, so it's either day ahead or it's real time. So, gotcha. Okay, there's no HASP in EDAM. Gotcha.
Right. Well, there is HASP, but remember we're doing the transfers, so the binding is real time. It'll be considered in HASP, but binding is real time. It's no longer an intertie schedule itself. It's a transfer.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I see Steve's hand still up. Steve, do you have another comment or question?
I do not. I'm just challenged on lowering my hand. Sorry.
Oh. I just want to make sure I don't accidentally miss you. That's all. Is there any other questions?
On the phone?
We do not have any questions on the phone.
Okay. I'm not seeing any in the chat either.
Okay. So I'm done with my portion of this presentation. I will turn it back over to Isabella.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Deb. So I'm going to move into next steps. So we have several other EDM workshops scheduled throughout July, with the next two being at the end of this week on Thursday and Friday. So they will be offered both in person and in a virtual format. And so on the 14th, we'll be focusing on the day-ahead RSC, specifically the WSPP Schedule C for energy transactions and the non-RA intertide bid treatment. And then we also did add a topic, and it'll be the first topic of the day that we discussed, and it will be treatment of transmission in the RSC. And then on the 15th, again, we'll be covering day-ahead RSC topics, so it'll be failure consequences framework and then the pooled WEIM RSC concept. And then after those two workshops at the end of this week, we'll move into some virtual workshops the following week. So on the 19th and 20th, we will cover transmission, specifically bucket 3 transmission and revenue recovery framework, and then the transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation. And then we'll pick it back up again the following week with some workshops that are offered in person and virtually again, with workshops in Salt Lake City. And we will focus on confidence in transfers, GHG accounting, and then the day-ahead RSC and transmission, and any recap or review from discussions from prior workshops. And then the 27th will focus on GHG accounting. So if you haven't registered already for the in-person workshops offered in Sacramento and Salt Lake City, I encourage you to do so. The registration link is available in the market notices that were posted for these workshops. And then my last slide today is just a reminder that the ISO will be holding its 2022 Stakeholder Symposium on November 9th and 10th in Sacramento, California at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center. And registration for that event is now open. So I encourage you to register for that event as well, and that registration link is found on this slide. But if you have any questions related to the symposium, you can also send an email to symposium registration or symposiumreg@kaiso.com. And that email is also linked on this slide. But before we wrap up, I just want to open it up for any last questions and give the ISO team a chance to make any last comments as well. Any questions?
No one's going to say anything. I'll say something. This is Mark. I just want to thank everybody for the robust dialogue today. I know there's a lot of questions. I think both policy and kind of mechanics, which I think is helpful at this point. I just want to thank you for the detail that we're getting into and the attention to these details. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your participation today. We really appreciate it. It was a great discussion. Partha, do you have anything else you want to add before we conclude?
No, Mark said it very nicely. So yeah, I'll just probably reiterate my thanks for the good feedback in the comments and the productive dialogue. So yeah, thanks again.
All right. Well, that concludes today's workshop. Thank you for joining, and we'll talk later this week. Have a good one.
That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.